Hi, I'm Sosik, Director of UX Research at Verizon. Do you know specifically what impact you had in your company this past year? If this question makes you pause, or maybe you can think of all the things that you did, but not what change came about as a result, then this talk is for you. I'll be giving you a framework you can use to think concretely about the impact your research makes and to track this progress. But first, why impact? Why does it matter, and why is it something that we should put effort into tracking? One of the first reasons to track impact is that it can help you realize your personal career goals. When I'm having conversations or interviewing other researchers, I often hear that the reason they're in this field is to make an impact. So it's something that matters to us at a personal level. Yet being a UX researcher is tough, and we can have bad days where we feel like our research goes unnoticed or is being ignored. On those days, I found that having a record of all that we have accomplished can be really helpful, and skimming through this record can help give me the motivation to get past those bumps in the road. Tracking your impact is also an invaluable tool when it comes to performance evaluations. No matter where you work, you're likely required to complete some sort of self-assessment at least once a year. And when I'm coaching my teams through this process, I'm always reminding them that this self-assessment should not be a list of what they did over the review period. In other words, I don't want to see lists of projects or studies, but it should be what they achieved or how the work has impacted the business. If we're only thinking about our work in this way once or twice a year, it can be hard to remember the details of our accomplishments. Having an impact tracker that you fill out in the moment as you go makes writing strong self-assessments really easy. I've also used impact tracking heavily as I became a manager and as I've grown research teams. In this role, you're not just thinking about your own impact, but the impact of many researchers working on many projects across a larger scope of work. It can get even harder to stay on top of impact as the volume increases, but being able to speak specifically to how your team has impacted your company helps you justify asking for resources. It's much more powerful when you go to ask for headcount or budget, when you can give specific examples of what you've accomplished with the resources that you do have, and what more you'll be able to accomplish with the additional resources that you're asking for. In all of these examples I just gave, it wasn't just important to do research that has impact, but it was critical to be able to notice the signals that you achieved impact, and also that you know how to communicate it, whether it be to yourself, your manager, or your company's leadership. So what is it? What's impact? Borrowing from academia, where the topic of research impact is routinely discussed, I'll define impact in our field as when the knowledge generated by UX research influences another person, organization, product, or strategy. And it's also important to call out alongside this definition, what isn't impact? Because it can be hard to distinguish between routes to research impact and the impact itself. But impact is not something that you as a researcher can do. You can encourage it through impact activities, but the impact is always the influence that your work has, not the work itself. This definition also helps to show why tracking impact is so important. Because while your research and other impact activities might be recorded in decks, presentations, or other documentation by default, the influence of your research often isn't. So tracking impact is the act of recording these instances of influence so that you're able to speak to them and further your personal and professional goals, as I talked about earlier. So how do we do it? Now I'll walk through a framework and the tools that I've used over the past several years with my teams to track their impact. This framework is really quite simple and has three main parts: the research activity that drove the impact or the recordable instance of influence, and the scale of the impact. The research activity is the what. What did you do? Oftentimes this will be a specific research study, but it's not limited to just that. It could also be the creation of a synthesis document, leading a cross-functional workshop, or developing a policy for conducting ethical research, as a few other examples. The next piece is the type of impact. This is a key part of the framework because it fleshes out the more academic definition of impact and makes it more concrete for our practice. In this framework, I track 8 different types of impact. The first type is influenced product change. This type of impact tends to be the most concrete and the easiest to notice because you can directly tie the finding and recommendation from your research to a change made in a product. Whether it be a problem that you identified that then gets fixed, or a feature that your research suggests users want then gets built, influenced product change is a signal that your stakeholders are consuming your research and acting on it. Sometimes influence can go beyond a single product design or design decision and influence product strategy. With this type of impact, you're seeing your research influence a team's quarterly or yearly goals. For example, they introduce a completely new product concept, or your research blocks a launch that would have negatively impacted the user experience. While these first two types of impact are very tied to products, there are also types of impact that speak more towards driving cultural change in an organization. These are often harder to notice and to track. One type is simply increased stakeholder exposure to users, or when new stakeholders participate in research activities or request research training. This is a meaningful type of impact because people's time is often one of their most valuable resources. So if they're choosing to spend it participating in research with you, that's a strong signal to the value that they place on research. Seeing others share research and communications is another type of impact. This could be someone citing your work in a presentation or even mentioning it in an email. The fact that it's someone other than yourself doing the sharing is important here because it shows that a stakeholder has consumed your research, absorbed it, and is using it in their own communications to further their work. Another type of impact is prompting further research. This is when a team chooses to further investigate a research finding, either through a live experiment, a new marketing effort, a new UX research initiative, or the like. Again, this is a signal of the value being placed on the research because each of these efforts takes someone in the organization's time and also likely a significant amount of budget being allocated to following up on the outcomes of your work. Prompting a new collaboration is also an example of impact. Whether it be a collaboration with a new stakeholder born out of them seeing your prior work, or collaboration with another insights function that leads to triangulation of your findings with other data, it's an example of interest in your research and further driving user centricity in an organization. This next type of impact is similar, but distinct in that it's all about elevating the status of UX research within your organization. This may come in the form of a new collaboration, but one with increasingly senior levels of leadership or functions that are critical to UX research being acted on. For example, being invited to key decision-making forums where UX research wasn't involved in the past. And finally, developing UX research infrastructure is a type of impact. This type looks more inward amongst UX researchers and is in the form of establishing a new method or developing a new process. If other researchers or teams think that what you did warrants replicating, that's a strong signal of the value that you're bringing to the practice of UX research. So these are the 8 types of impact. The next component of the framework is the scale of the impact. Oftentimes, researchers grow in their careers by demonstrating larger and larger spheres of influence. So it's useful to take note of the scale of impact that you're having with your work so you can communicate that alongside the impact itself. Exactly how you categorize scale will depend on the size and structure of your company, but I'll give you an example of the different levels that I've used working at 2 quite large companies. At the smallest scale is the individual stakeholder who requested the research or who the research is done with. One person is taking action based on your insights. Next is an individual project or team that the research was done with, a small group of people focused on one feature or element of an experience. Beyond an individual project or team, you have a body of work. This is generally a grouping of projects or teams that work on a similar topic. This scale may be realized because you have a more senior stakeholder who oversees this larger body of work, or maybe your work was picked up by multiple teams within that body of work and outside of the original team that you worked with for that research. Next is an organization. This is an even higher level grouping of bodies of work, usually led by a director or a VP in a large company. When you're impacting beyond an organization, your work is having impact at the company level. This means that multiple organizations within your company are being influenced by your research. And finally, you can impact beyond your company by sharing knowledge or skills with the outside world. So how to put this framework into practice? It's as simple as using every researcher's favorite tool, a spreadsheet. The Impact Tracker spreadsheet has columns to track each of the components of the framework that I described above: the research activity, the type of impact, broken down into both a description of the impact and the category, and the scale of the impact. Each example of impact gets its own entry, so it's very possible that a single research activity will be associated with many entries in the Impact Tracker. There are some other columns I also add to track additional details, but these are completely optional or customizable to what's relevant to your company. At Verizon, we use Airtable to track our studies, so it was really easy to build an impact tracker alongside it that automatically pulls in the relevant information about a research activity. I like to track the date the impact was realized along with the date of the research activity as additional columns. This allows you to look across all the instances of impact for a single research activity and see whether something is having lasting impact, or impact that's being realized long after the activity took place, which is a sign of particularly strong work. I also tracked the researcher who drove the impact for easy reference, as well as the focus area of the research and the type of research, whether it be generative, iterative, or evaluative. These last two columns are particularly useful for tracking your impact as a tool to reflect on work and to set goals for how you want to evolve your practice. For example, you can see trends in what types of research are driving what types of impact, or what areas of work are or aren't connected to impact. Maybe your iterative research is having frequent impact on product change, but you're not seeing it impact product strategy. You might set a goal from this that you want to synthesize your iterative work once a quarter and present it back as a set of opportunities and pain points to help drive a team's strategic goals. It's possible to keep your own individual impact tracking spreadsheet, but I recommend keeping it at the team level, where multiple researchers are tracking impact in the same place. This has a few advantages. Very tactically speaking, from a manager's perspective, it's great to have all this information in one place and not scattered around. But I also think it helps to build a shared understanding across a research team of what research impact really is and how we can recognize it by constantly seeing examples of the impact our peers are having. Research activities are often collaborative, so not having to artificially split up the tracking by researcher is also helpful. I've occasionally heard pushback that researchers would feel more comfortable tracking in private and not bragging about themselves in a shared file. However, I think that this is actually another reason to keep a shared tracker. One of the more uncomfortable skills that we have to learn as researchers is how to talk about our successes and make them known so that our work is visible to our leadership. So I think it's a great way to practice in a shared team tracker. But perhaps the most compelling reason to keep a shared tracker is because tracking impact really is a team sport, and you want others to keep an eye out for examples of impact your work is making, and vice versa. This framework that I presented and the impact tracker itself are very simple. The thing that makes impact tracking challenging is that you're not always in the conversations where your research is having impact. Maybe your research is informing decisions for a completely different team than you work with, which is great since that demonstrates a larger scale of impact. But how would you know? This is where having a colleague filling out an entry in the tracker for you is invaluable. As a manager, I'm also constantly seeing examples of my team's work being referenced in conversations or emails that they may not necessarily be a part of. In those cases, it's on me to fill out the tracker. And this brings up another important part of the process: when to track impact. And I'll say always in the moment. It takes only a minute or two to jot something down when you become aware of it and when it's fresh in your memory. When you have that email that just called out a great piece of work, or the document handy, or maybe you're in a meeting and can quickly type out a quote from a leader who finds a piece of research critical in their work. These details will fade after time, so you're only cheating yourself and your team members by waiting until later to track your impact. That being said, I also do recommend a quarterly review of your impact tracker, both to reflect on your work and to understand any trends, but also to actively chase down impact that you might not have passively observed throughout the quarter. It's important to capture impact as you go, but even with you and your team on the lookout, you'll likely miss something. Especially for larger projects or projects where you don't have many or any entries in the tracker, I urge you to talk to your stakeholders and ask, how did you use this research in your work? What decisions did you make based on it? Perhaps make this group reflection on the past quarter the warm-up to your planning discussions for an upcoming quarter, or otherwise work it into some existing team processes. But don't be afraid to ask. While an impact tracker will likely never be complete, and it doesn't need to be in order to be a powerful tool, you still want it to be as complete as possible. So in this talk, I've explained how tracking impact can help you meet personal career goals, help you write stronger performance evaluations to grow your career, and help you make the case for resources, whether it be headcount or money, to conduct more research. I've also presented a simple framework for tracking impact that includes the research activity itself, the type or category of impact, and the scale of impact. And finally, I talked through a simple spreadsheet tool and how to use it to get going on tracking your own impact and the impact of others. And I'll be making this template available through the UXR Collective, including some made-up but realistic examples of entries in the tracker. These examples will also help to give some more detail on what specific signals you can look for that demonstrate the different types of impact that I talked about, something that I didn't fully dive into here in this talk. But while I use the word simple more than once in this wrap-up, I know that you're thinking that this is just one more thing to do or to manage on top of my day-to-day research, and us researchers are already stretched thin. I get that, and I feel that too. But I want you to think of one of your next career goals as a researcher. Are you hoping to get promoted in the next review cycle or the one after? Have you been really wanting to start managing other researchers, but there just hasn't been headcount to hire anyone beyond yourself? Being able to speak clearly and concretely about the impact that your research has made on your company is what is going to get you there. And the first step is really just to start your spreadsheet.